Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever stopped to think how a movement, one starting with so much passion and lay involvement, could kind of drift over time? How its core structure could change, maybe leading to things nobody really expected?
It's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and today we're diving deep into that very thing, looking at how leadership models evolved within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We'll trace it from, the biblical roots through those early pioneer days, right up to how things often look now.
And our mission today, really, is to unpack something quite specific your sources raise.
Mm-hmm.
Is this new leadership model, which they call strange to the New Testament and early Adventism, is it directly tied to things like pastoral dependency or maybe minister burnout? And, the fact that so many church members don't seem to be using their spiritual gifts. We're not just looking at history for history's sake.
Right.
We're trying to see if there's a link, maybe even a sort of alarming one, where a subtle shift created this cycle of dependency. Good for neither the pastors nor the members, really.
And these aren't just like theoretical ideas. The sources we're looking at ask some really direct questions. Things like, is this the reason why we do not see the priesthood of all believers being exercised in the church today?
That core idea.
That every single member is a minister, right, with gifts to use. And then, is there any relation between the shifting on the leadership model and the inactivity of the majority of churchgoers?
The connection seems crucial to explore.
And finally, what about spiritual gifts? We hold this strong belief in them doctrinally, but the source asks, how can we somehow avoid making use of them? These feel like really fundamental questions.
They are. And we want to show you the connections, sometimes subtle ones, between these historical shifts and, well, the challenges many communities face today. We're asking if this model, described as strange, is really causing pastoral dependency, pastoral burnout, and the avoidance of the priesthood of all believers by ignoring the spiritual gifts. We'll break that down.
Okay, let's do it. So, to unpack this, let's start at the beginning. What did church leadership actually look like in the New Testament in those very earliest days? And how did that blueprint, if you will, influence the Adventist pioneers?
Right. So the early church model, it was a completely new form of governance, really. It grew up organically, in the midst of persecution and expansion. Very communal.
Okay.
Deeply rooted in kingdom of God values. Jesus himself, well, he chose the 12, sent them out 2 by 2. That's Luke 10. And he taught this radical idea of the servant leader, challenging the whole top-down authority thing we see in Mark 10.
That does sound pretty radical. What made it so, revolutionary compared to how things usually work then? Was it just being communal?
That's a great point because it went deeper. A key thing the sources highlight is its respect for volunteer work and nonprofit goals.
Yeah.
This created, as one course puts it, an abyssal distance from profit-driven structures. It wasn't just organization, it was a whole different ethos.
A different spirit behind it all.
Exactly. Spiritually, Jesus was the head. Gifts were poured out on every disciple, leading to this active priesthood of all believers. Governance involved councils, making sure, everyone got their fair share of participation.
So super engaged, decentralized, everyone had a part. How was it structured day to day then?
Yeah, highly engaged. Your sources point to 3 main functions.
Yeah.
First, you had the apostles. These were the traveling ministers, the itinerary ministries responsible for new churches, overseeing missions. They were the planters.
Constantly moving.
Right. Then, elders, or bishops. These are the local leaders, often trained by the apostles, providing that ongoing local shepherding. And finally, deacons, the hands in action of the church. One source, Burrell, even suggests deacon could just mean minister, implying every believer is a minister.
So everyone's involved in the mission directly. Seems very clear role-wise. But were there any weaknesses? Did the sources hint at any challenges even back then?
That's perceptive, because while this dynamic model fueled incredible growth, even under pressure, it wasn't static. Your sources point to the early 2nd century. That's when the first real shift started. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to Smyrnaeans, it gave the elder, the bishop, an extra level of authority.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he famously wrote, and this is a quote, "Let no man do anything of what belongs to the church separately from the bishop. It is not lawful without the bishop, neither to baptize nor to celebrate the Holy Communion." That's seen as the first milestone for the abandonment of that original, more decentralized model. Power starts to centralize.
Wow. Okay, fast forward centuries. This is where it gets really interesting because early Adventism seems to have consciously tried to get back to that original blueprint, didn't they? How did they go about that?
They absolutely did try. The movement came from various backgrounds,
Yeah.
Methodism being a big influence, which is key here. And crucially, they were initially averse to organizations, seeing them as potentially like the Babylon of prophecy.
Right, that suspicion of structure.
Exactly. So they actively sought the most biblical model of leadership possible. And they found something very similar in the Methodist approach, which itself echoed that New Testament itinerant lay-focused style.
So what did that look like practically for early Adventists? How did someone like James White set things up?
Well, in 1863, under his leadership, they decided ministers would be itinerant, moving around, focused on administration, evangelism, kind of like the apostles again.
Okay.
Elders, though, were elected by the local church to shepherd the members and be the chairman of the board. The sources call it basically a lay movement. James White, back in 1862, explicitly argued against a fixed ministry or settled pastor.
He didn't like that idea at all.
Not one bit. The goal was a member-driven church. And the records show it worked, how the early church and early Adventism, with so few people, were able to grow so much. The core belief was clear. The church cannot be dependent on the pastoral figure, everyone involved unified by the Bible.
Okay, so if early Adventism mirrored the New Testament so closely, focusing on lay power, itinerant ministers, how did we end up somewhere so different today? What caused that big shift?
Well, it wasn't overnight. The shift was gradual, driven by a few things happening around the same time. First, there was this sense of weariness setting in among members. People were slowing down the pace.
Losing a team.
Yeah, and elders maybe weren't leading as effectively. Members started to disengage from ministries. One source suggests maybe the heavy focus on international missions drew energy away, or perhaps the delay of the second coming compared to what they expected. It was described as members losing their first love.
So a sort of spiritual fatigue, maybe, and the pioneers were fading out too. Was there a specific person or moment that really pushed the settled pastor idea?
There really was. With that backdrop, the first person to openly argue for it in the church paper, the Review and Herald, was Dudley M. Cartwright. And the timing is, well, telling. It was August 9th, 1881, just 3 days after James White died.
Wow. 3 days after the main opponent passes away.
Exactly. You can't really ignore that symbolism.
No kidding. So Cartwright made a practical case, looking at other churches. But besides just keeping churches alive, were there other arguments, maybe even theological ones, that helped persuade people, especially given how strongly the pioneers felt?
That's key to understanding it. Cartwright's argument was primarily pragmatic. He wrote, "Every sect of Christians have found it necessary to bestow much labor upon their churches. All have had settled pastors. In this way, churches have been kept alive." He contrasted that with Adventist churches being largely left to care for themselves.
So the justification was basically stability. What worked elsewhere?
Pretty much. It was an appeal to organizational stability and what seemed like effective practice in other groups. The underlying thought seemed to have been that the itinerant model, while maybe biblical, was just too demanding, maybe impractical for sustaining local churches long term.
Okay, so practicality won out over the original model, it sounds like. After Cartwright's push and the pioneers passing, how did this change actually become official policy?
Well, during the early 1900s, and especially after Ellen White died, the church slowly started putting settled pastors in place. It was described as a timid practice in the beginning, but it was quietly spreading.
Creeping in.
Yeah. And then the shift was confirmed and became official in the first published church manual in 1932. That really cemented the new model institutionally.
But James White, you said, was vehemently against it. What was his core argument exactly?
You're right, it wasn't smooth sailing.
Right.
White was deeply opposed, rooted in that New Testament idea. He wrote back in 1862, "It does not appear to have been the design of Christ that his ministers should become stationed, salaried preachers."
Station salaried preachers. Okay.
He saw Paul as an apostle, always moving, not a settled pastor.
Mm.
For White, the minister's job was itinerant. Establish a body of believers who could then sustain the worship of God themselves.
Right.
Then the minister would pass on to a new field, only coming back occasionally to exhort, confirm, and comfort.
So churches should stand on their own feet, spiritually mature, not needing constant hand-holding. He saw settled pastor as almost hindering that.
Precisely. He stressed that churches were not carried upon the shoulders of their ministers. The very term settled pastor, it had this negative connotation for them, contrasting sharply with the mission to go. And others echoed this, like J.N. Liveborough in 1907, who wrote a book supporting Ellen White's view on the minister's evangelistic role. It was really a clash of visions, expansion versus maintenance.
And Ellen White herself, as this change was gaining ground, what was her take?
Well, even as things were shifting, Ellen White was incredibly clear and consistent in her opposition. Her statements from around 1902 are blunt. There should not be a call to have settled pastors over our churches.
No ambiguity there.
None. She saw the settled pastor thing as a problem for everyone, the church and the pastor. She foresaw pastoral dependency. Her core belief never wavered. The New Testament way was the best method. Anything else was disturbingly problematic.
And she saw ministers more as planters, right? Not just shepherds.
Exactly. Their job was to sow the seeds of truth. Place after place is to be visited. Church after church is to be raised up. Then the minister is to pass on to other equally important fields.
That's such an outward focus. What about when churches had problems, though? Did she expect ministers to keep running back to fix things?
No, quite the opposite.
Hmm.
She specifically warned against ministers getting bogged down in fixing church issues. She said, God has not given his ministers the work of setting the churches right. No sooner is this work done, apparently, than it has to be done over again.
A cycle of fixing.
Right. And the result, this is where she used that really striking phrase, church members that are thus looked after and labored for become religious weaklings.
Religious weaklings.
Mm.
Wow, that's a heavy statement. She's drawing a direct line between the leadership model and spiritual health.
She absolutely did. And she went further, linking it to spiritual vitality itself, saying God has withheld his blessings because his people have not worked in harmony with his directions. She was also crystal clear on member responsibility.
How so?
She told them, do not depend on the ministers to do all the work in your church and neighborhood. Instead, ministers should seek the lost sheep, and you must help them. She really empowered members, saying they must have light in themselves for preaching. She urged them, you must not trust them as your saviors, but build yourselves up.
Take ownership.
Yes, her ideal. Members telling ministers essentially, go, work for souls out there, we'll handle the services here, we'll work for souls around us, and we'll support you out there with prayers and gifts. That is a world away from how many people experience church today.
It really is. So if the pioneers warned so clearly, what have been the actual long-term effects, maybe unintended effects, of shifting away from that original model?
Well, the numbers your sources cite are pretty stark. A 2019 conference reported only about 10.01% of membership were involved with some ministry over the week.
Only 10%.
Yeah, meaning almost 89.99% out of any involvement. That points to a massive underuse of spiritual gifts. And Ellen White saw this trend starting even back then. She noted, churches are dying, and they want a minister to preach to them. Unless they can stand alone, they need to be converted anew. Today, that relationship can sometimes resemble trade, members expecting good sermons to fulfill entertainment needs.
So church becomes less about active participation, more like consuming a service, leading to that maintenance cycle you mentioned.
Exactly that. It leads to what the sources call a maintenance cycle. The church turns inward, the pastor ends up doing things members should be doing, and it causes spiritual feebleness. Ellen White's solution: get members involved in efficient missionary work, turn the focus outwards again.
Right.
She even wrote with a grieved tone about pastors just hovering over the churches instead of reaching lost souls. So the effect is two-sided. Members can become passive, dependent consumers, and pastors end up taking on roles that weren't originally theirs.
That paints a concerning picture for the members. But what about the pastors? How has this shift hit their ministry, their well-being?
Oh, the impact on pastors is huge. Often it leads to this feeling of displacement and burnout. Pastors feel called by God to preaching for soul salvation, but end up doing every other thing.
Like what?
They train for evangelism, but they're dealing with building churches, preaching existentialism, meaning sermons focused on keeping current members happy rather than reaching out and attending individual matters. Ellen White saw pastors spending much of their time laboring for those who have been in the truth for years but who are still weak, dealing with petty difficulty and trial. Their souls, she said, get grieved and wounded.
So they get pulled away from their core calling, burdened with stuff meant for the whole church. That must be incredibly frustrating.
It really is. Many feel overwhelmed by the tasks given by the conference, handling an increasing volume of individual issues they weren't even trained for. It leads to deep frustration, feeling like they're not fulfilling their call to grow the kingdom, just stuck maintaining the status quo. The very mission they signed up for gets pushed aside.
Okay, so if this current model has these serious downsides for everyone involved, what did Ellen White suggest as the alternative? What's the way forward according to her counsel?
Her advice for pastors was really clear. Get back to the New Testament call. That means raising churches and training them to use their spiritual gifts, then going ahead to the next field needed.
Training becomes key.
Absolutely. She said, let the minister devote more of his time to educating than to preaching. Teach people how to give to others the knowledge they have received. It's all about empowerment, not creating dependency. She urged pastors, teach them not to put the minister in the place of God, stressing, Christ is the one to whom we are to look.
So the pastor isn't the rescuer, but more like the equipper. The trainer who helps the church stand strong on its own. That's a totally different job description.
It really is. The pastor's main job, in her view, was to arrange matters so that every member shall have a part to act, that all may accomplish what they can for active work for the salvation of souls. She even used this surprising analogy from Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Really? How did that fit?
She talked about how leaving an easy escape route weakens an army's will to fight. Similarly, she argued, pastors who always step in to fix things can become a comfort point that actually weakens the church members. Pastors and believers should work together to end that cycle.
Interesting analogy.
Yeah, ministers should not hover over the churches already raised up. Instead, push for aggressive evangelistic work, preaching the word and doing house-to-house work in places that have not yet heard the truth. And just to be clear, that house-to-house work meant reaching the unconverted, not just visiting members. This outward focus, she believed, brings encouragement back.
That is a profound challenge to how things often are. It takes a different kind of courage, doesn't it? What are the bigger takeaways here for us, for the listeners?
Well, first, maybe be a bit wary of just adopting secular solutions or good practices without thinking deeply spiritually. The sources remind us that borrowing practices can be hurtful for a spiritual kingdom because, well, it's hard to separate our fallen nature from our God-given intellect. Instead, the path seems to be empowerment through responsibility. Ellen White put it powerfully. If ministers would get out of the way, members would be obliged to bear responsibilities, and their capabilities would increase by use.
Get out of the way. Wow.
Yeah. The core message. Depend on God, not just the minister. She wrote, do not lead people to depend upon you. Teach them rather that they are to use their talents. In thus working, they will have the cooperation of heavenly angels and gain a strong hold on God.
That really shifts the whole spiritual center of gravity, doesn't it? From passive receiving to active, spirit-led work. It sounds like she wanted a much more resilient, self-reliant church.
It absolutely does. Ministers should set up churches understanding that members need not expect the minister to wait upon them. They should have root in themselves. This even impacts things like Sabbath services. She actually said, church members are not to expect a sermon every Sabbath.
Really? Not every week.
That's what she wrote. So, boiling it down, this shift seems to have created a strong codependency, ultimately crippling the church by weakening members for not using their spiritual gifts. And that hurts everyone, pastoral function and health, and the church member's spirituality as well.
So this whole deep dive, it isn't about trying to turn back the clock or just being nostalgic, is it? It's more about critically looking at what actually builds spiritual health and achieves the mission.
Exactly. It's an attempt, as the sources say, to show that a change is needed. And the answer may be the restoration of the biblical model. It's about having the courage to change, once again, if needed, even if the status quo is being challenged, even if it will cost money. Because ultimately, that forward-moving, adaptive spirit is the very nature of this movement.
What a truly fascinating and maybe challenging deep dive. We've traced this journey from the early church through early Adventism, seeing that clear model of lay power moving ministers. Then we charted that, well, subtle but huge shift to the settled pastor model, despite strong warnings from the founders.
Yeah.
And we've seen the powerful, sometimes painful results for both members and pastors, that maintenance cycle, the decline in using gifts.
Indeed. And we've heard Ellen White's stark warnings about religious weaklings, about withheld blessings, and her contrasting vision. Pastors as trainers, planters, fostering that vibrant priesthood of all believers. This isn't just dusty history. It hits right at the heart of church health and mission today.
It really does.
Which leaves a crucial question for you, the listener. How do you see that balance playing out between pastoral leadership and the active ministry of every single member in your community? And maybe more importantly, how could a renewed focus on training, on empowering everyone to use their gifts, transform your own experience and the church's wider mission?
That's a really powerful challenge for all of us. Makes you really think about leadership, responsibility, and, well, what it means to be the church. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into maybe why we see weaklings and why that priesthood of all believers is sometimes avoided. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.